So, one of the areas of postmodernism looks at what we call grand narratives or big stories, and the postmodernists want to destabilize the modern grand narratives. The postmodernists argue that the institutions of religion, science, and politics have not delivered on what they promised. They consider these modern institutions, even though, of course, science, politics, and religion have been around for a long, long time. The postmodernists see these institutions as a big part of the problem. They have said that the institutions of religion, science, and politics have not delivered on what they promised. They promised to make the world a better place, but they have failed. And as such, they want to undermine these different institutions and come up with alternative ways of pursuing their interests. Instead of big stories, they prefer multiple narratives, that subversion or undermining of the modern voices. So let's talk a little bit about what does this mean, a social institution. Well, you think of some of the major religious denominations in our country, in the Western world, and there have been scandals and things like that that should not have happened. And so people have lost faith, so to speak, in what they call organized religion. You may have heard people say that they don't like organized religion. Nowadays, it's very postmodern, for example, to talk about a personal relationship with God, but not necessarily be too tied to a denomination, or in other words, an institution. I happen to be a person of faith, and growing up in a postmodern era, I never really cared so much about what denomination I was a part of. And however, my parents' generation, they really felt a little more loyalty to the particular denomination, and I think that really does display this postmodern view of religion and religious institutions. The scientific-looking guy there symbolizes how the sciences at one point really were working on curing diseases, making vaccines and so forth, like curing polio and doing some other amazing medical miracles practically for a long stretch there in our country. Many advances, different kinds of surgeries, incredible stuff. But in the past 20, 30 years or even more, a lot of people have criticized, and I think quite fairly, the world of science for not working on that stuff anymore. For example, the pharmaceutical companies, there was a study done recently that looked at a stretch of about 25 years and said that since the mid-80s and beyond, only 1% of the medications that major pharmaceutical companies have researched and developed and approved are cures for diseases or vaccines. It almost doesn't exist. In fact, you may have read in the news or heard recently about Ebola and how Ebola is this very dangerous virus, but the pharmaceutical companies aren't really working on Ebola because it's not profitable. And you think, how can we, in this day and age, 21st century, how can we not have a cure for some of these very basic sicknesses that are common throughout the world? And the reason is the pharmaceutical companies and a lot of people in the sciences are working more toward commercial interests. Where can they make money? So they can make money on cures for baldness or erectile dysfunction or longer, thicker eyelashes and all of the others, what they call lifestyle drugs. So there's a lot of money there, and it doesn't take a lot to get those to market. And so a lot of people have really been down on the scientific institutions. I don't even know if any of the major pharmaceutical companies are working on cures for cancer, for example. I think it's all these special hospitals and universities associated with hospitals that are doing research on the real diseases. The pharmaceutical companies have just given up because it costs so much money, which is very sad. And there's a picture of Richard Nixon, and this is another grand narrative that the politicians will help us, will elect the right people, and they'll fix things. And the people in office are there for our good. That's the modern way of thinking. Then Richard Nixon came along, big scandal called Watergate. I won't go into it. You might want to Google that, though, to look into Watergate as an illustration. He did some illegal things, and people realized, oh my gosh, he abused his power so he could get reelected, and that's horrible. So a lot of people have lost trust in these major social institutions. It doesn't mean that there aren't good people of faith, good scientists, and good politicians out there. It just means that in a postmodern era, people don't tend to believe as much in the institution. And just as one final illustration, years ago, a lot of people were either registered Democrat or Republican, and now, I believe, what I read most recently, about 1/3 of voters consider themselves independent and are not affiliated with a political party. 1/3 Democrat, 1/3 Republican, roughly. And years ago, it would have been much closer to half and half. And so you see people are not really bound to their political institutions the way they used to be. They're much more open-minded about voting for the particular individual. So the postmodern condition is marked by a suspicion or rejection of these foundational or grand narratives, and they favor small stories, situated narratives, and pluralism. Plural means more than one. Lots of stories. And they want to destabilize that traditional dominant and subordinate relationship between the institutions that give us the big stories and our own individual way of doing things and expressing ourselves through our own channels. For example, years ago, even when I was growing up, I remember we had 3 television stations, 3 networks, and then there was sort of another type of bandwidth on the television too, which gave you some local stations, but or PBS, for example. But these were really the major networks, and they all had exactly the same kinds of shows on. They all told you the same thing, and that was your source of nightly news and nightly entertainment. Basically 3 voices for the entire nation, which is kind of strange, right? Nowadays, things are a little different. Nowadays, everybody has a voice. There's a channel to express yourself through social media. You can have your own channel, your own YouTube channel. There are some people out there with millions of subscribers, millions and millions of views. I saw one guy the other day, watching just some guy, 300 million views on his YouTube channel. When you think about the common or your regular TV shows, they don't have 300 million people watching them, and it's just incredible the voice, the way we can get our voice out there through new technologies like this. The icon in the top right is for Wikipedia. It's a sphere, not unlike a planet, and it's built of these puzzle pieces. It's supposed to look 3-dimensional. Each of these puzzle pieces has a different language, and it's not yet complete. And that really symbolizes a fantastic logo for the postmodern era. We have a society that is reflected in this Wikipedia, where anybody can chime in, anybody can add their own voice, a plurality of voices, not one source of the authoritative word, but everybody chipping in and saying what they want to say. It's one of the reasons why a lot of teachers don't like students to cite or use Wikipedia, because it's edited by people just like you and me. There are no very few safeguards. Everybody just edits and then re-edits and edits, so it's changing every single day. It's not considered an academic source of any kind. But it is a good symbol of the postmodern world. Everything's fluid, everything's changing, lots of voices, lots of pluralism, situated stories, small stories, not just the big grand narratives. The postmodern condition or age is also marked by some other things, like the rise of the information age economy. People say we're in an information age, we're in a knowledge age, and they have different words for it. Essentially, we're not really anymore in the industrial revolution, the industrial age, where we're building lots of new factories and pumping out cars like crazy. Yeah, we're still producing things, but the real areas of growth in our economy are things happening over information technology. There's the rise of the global media, so that's obvious, we're all interconnected all the time, but also decontextualized spectacle, not genuine knowledge. So how many things do you see come across your social media every day that end up being fake, or hoaxes or something? And you see, oh, it's like a little image of Bigfoot, and you go, oh my gosh, but you don't know where the video came from, you don't know when it was taken, you don't know who made it and what their story is. And a lot of times these end up being hoaxes, but it doesn't matter because it's a spectacle, right? We're not really there for genuine information or knowledge. we're looking at these things to be distracted in a way. It's like an escape. It's a relief from, quote, real world, the real world, and it's in that way a decontextualized. There's no context for this spectacle. And we have what we call hyper realities. We have a whole world that's not really corresponding to the actual world, and virtual reality games, things like SimCity and so forth, and the explosion of extremely realistic video games that people are engrossed in. They don't correspond in any way to the real world, and some people get so sucked in it becomes their world. So this is very postmodern, where you have to distinguish between online and offline lives. Here's an image, for example. If you looked at it quickly, you might have thought just for a second you were looking at New York City, when in fact it's a hotel. This is a hotel in Las Vegas. It's all one structure. It's all one building. They just took what looks like the New York City skyline and they smushed it all together and called it the New York Hotel. And there's even a Statue of Liberty there, not full size, but pretty big. None the same. You can see the cars down below. It's pretty massive. So this is a hyper reality. Las Vegas is a great example of a postmodern city where you go and everything is decontextualized. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and you know, everybody goes there, and it's magic shows and other kinds of crazy performances and Cirque du Soleil, and it's all these strange expressions of humanity. And we're not even talking about the gambling part, because we're talking about the way the city is designed and the whole mentality in it. And they're destroying buildings and building new hotels in their place all the time. It's just routine that they're blasting these buildings to pieces and building new ones every 20, 25 years. A building's old after 25, 30 years. A new hotel needs to be built in its place. And it's a very postmodern city. In some ways, it's a little ahead. Not ahead culturally, not ahead in terms of progress, but ahead of the curve in terms of artistic expression and architecture, where it really has fully embraced the postmodern way of thinking. Here's Hannah Montana in The Happiest Place on Earth. I'm told this is Miley Cyrus, but she's in Disney World. And this is another hyper reality, the happiest place on earth. I mean, they created a whole little place just to spread happiness, but it's happiness in a very strange way. I mean, you're hanging out with a mouse and you're going on rides, and it's just a total escape from reality, really. Very, again, decontextualized spectacle. When you're there, it all sort of makes sense because it's mostly a fantasy that you get caught up in, but it's a very postmodern way of thinking that you can create a whole reality that doesn't correspond to a real reality, anything real. Even Hannah Montana's character, I mean, Miley Cyrus's character, Hannah Montana, it's one person pretending to be another person. And as we talk about identity in a few minutes, you'll see that is very postmodern, where even our identities are fluid. And reality TV, very hot topic. Is it real? Is it not? Well, one thing is for sure, it's on TV. Another thing is for sure, the people on these get paid. And another thing is also known, and that is that these shows have writers, they have scripts they follow, and people have to audition to be on them. So if you put two and two together, how real are they? Well, probably not very real at all. The only thing real about it is that the people on the shows perhaps keep their names. You know, in other words, Donald Trump is still Donald Trump on The Apprentice, and so forth. But other than that, there's not much real about it. In fact, on Duck Dynasty is a show that's been on for a while, and one of the people from Duck Dynasty was on Dancing with the Stars, and she said, well, there's a lot of pressure on Dancing with the Stars because on Duck Dynasty they can shoot things 10 times if they need to get it right, but on Dancing with the Stars, you know, if you go out there and you trip and fall, everybody sees it. And everybody got excited, like, what? You film things 10 times on Duck Dynasty? That's supposed to be a reality show. And, you know, it's just I hope I'm not shattering people's dreams or anything, but there was a time where people thought Gilligan's Island was a real island and these people were really trapped on it. So the television creates a powerful illusion, and these are hyper realities. They're realities that are created and broadcast for our consumption. That's why they put it on television. That's why there are commercial breaks and so forth. And I know actors who have auditioned and got cast on these shows. They're working actors, comedians, and things like that. So even what's real and is claimed to be real is not all that real. So let's turn now to postmodern art. First we'll look at modern art, but modern art has a sense of realism. A lot of things we've been talking about show that in the architecture and media and things like that. It does allow for some creativity, but it follows many of the basic conventional rules to create what's called a realistic or recognizable image. Postmodern art, in contrast, distorts reality and distorts the norms and of the modern art era. There are rules about things, and you may have felt this yourself. You may have looked at a piece of art and said, I have no idea how to make sense of this, and it's, you know, this could be terrible. How would I know? You're probably looking at a piece of postmodern art. So here's some modern art. This is obviously a guy. It's a man. You can tell he has male facial features and a mustache and a hat, and the proportions are a little off. His head is, you know, probably larger than it should be for his body. But basically, it's a realistic looking painting compared to some of the more clearly more postmodern things we're going to look at. Here's another modern piece. A guy who's fretting or stressed about something. His wife is trying to comfort him. Perhaps he's thinking about the Buffalo Bills in this image and getting very concerned. But again, it looks almost like a photograph, like a creative type of photograph, and you can tell there's two people here. You can tell what's going on emotionally with them is probably difficult, not good. It's modern. It makes sense. Here we have The Guitarist. This is by a guy named Picasso, very famous painter. People will say this is postmodern. I'm highlighting it here as a transitional piece, especially for someone like Picasso, but I call it transitional because it has a lot of modern sensibilities to it. You can tell it's a guy. He's playing the guitar. It's called The Guitarist. He's a little lanky, a little strange looking, a little distorted in his proportions, but you can basically tell what it is. This was done during Picasso's blue period. They call it his blue period, where he painted a lot in these blue tones. So now we're transitioning to more postmodern art, and you can see here the clear difference between modern and postmodern. This person's face, perhaps it's a woman, it's hard to tell, looks like it used to be in 3 dimensions, and then someone smushed it onto the page back into 2 dimensions, flattened it out with like how you might iron a shirt. So her left eye doesn't look like it's complete, or maybe that means it's closed, I don't know, but the proportions are really strange. No one has a face actually shaped like that, and it still has some realistic tendencies. You can tell it's a person, but it's getting more postmodern compared to the ones we've looked at. Here is a clearly postmodern image. So I think this is a jazz trio, I think it's called, and there looks like 3 musicians playing instruments of some sort, but I mean, look at their faces. Very strange looking. I'm not an artist, but I think this is called cubism, where a lot of the 3 dimensions are squashed down into what look like little cubes or triangles, and it's meant to challenge what we understand as realistic. You can even tell here that the musician on the left looks like his face is actually blending into the instrument a bit. Could be in front of the instrument, but maybe not. It's hard to tell if those tuning pegs are part of his head or not, but very fascinating looking painting. This is very postmodern. It's hard to tell where one person ends and the other begins. It breaks a lot of the rules of symmetry, of balance, of realism and proportion. Here's a well-known painting by a young female artist. They call her the next Picasso. Her full name is escaping me. I believe it's Alexandra Nikita, perhaps, or Alexandra Nikolai or something like that. I think it starts with an N. And she is very well known. She painted this, I believe, when she was a teenager, and her paintings sell for about $100,000 or more. She's supposed to be genius level, Picasso level, and she's been painting like this since she was very young. So here we have what looks like an individual, a person. Is it male, female? We don't know. Their proportions are all off. The arms and legs are strange looking. You can see some articulated abdomen muscles or ribs perhaps in the middle there, but very strange and creative painting, going much more here for emotion than for realism, not trying to capture something that looks, quote, real or like a photograph, but trying to express whatever the artist is trying to express. Here's a well-known Picasso painting. This is of his daughter. The most common thing he painted was his daughter, more paintings of her than anything else, and it's a little unsettling to look at. A lot of times people think, oh, this is just weird and anybody could do that. Well, go ahead and try. I was once at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, and what they had there was a painting not unlike this. And then next to it they had a series of about 10 sketches that Picasso made preparing to do the painting. So the first sketch looked very realistic, very normal. And then the next sketch distorted that same image just a little bit, drew the eyes out, exaggerated certain features a little. And then the third painting drew them out a little more, flattened them out, started to squash and stretch parts and make them more rigid and cubist. And this pattern went on for a 10 drawing sketch series, and by the end, the 10th sketch it was reminiscent of the original sketch. However, it was very distorted and very strange, but it took him 10 separate fully developed sketches to get there, and then he painted the painting to look like the final sketch that he made. So the guy was metaphorically working his butt off to make paintings that looked this weird and this odd. And there's a story, don't know if it's true, but I have heard it from different people over the years about Picasso, and there is somebody who's looking at his paintings, a gentleman looking at his paintings, and he was looking at a painting like this, and he said, well, why don't you just paint your daughter how she actually looks? And Picasso said, well, that's what she looks like to me. And he didn't necessarily mean visually, but this is how he perceives her. In other words, he's capturing emotion, he's capturing personality, he's putting his own view on things. And the guy said, no, this doesn't look like your daughter. It can't. He said, why don't you paint it to look like a real person? And the man pulled out a wallet-sized picture of his own daughter and said, like this, why don't you paint your daughter so she looks like this? And Picasso said to him, oh, is this your daughter? And he says, yes, it is. And he said, and does she look like that? And he says, yes, she looks just like this. This photo was taken very recently. And Picasso said to the man, my, she's a small girl, isn't she? And what he meant by that is not that she was actually small, but rather since this was a wallet-sized photo, and this guy was saying she looks just like that, that Picasso was implying that his daughter was really just several inches tall. And so his point there is that every artist, even a photographer, has a point of view and puts their perspective in it, just like he does. So this is very postmodern here in terms of distorting and destabilizing the norms or conventions of modern thinking. Theater is the same way. Nowadays we have postmodern theater. Here's a picture of very modern theater. I don't know what show they're doing, but they're singing and dancing and everything's organized, and they have a stage and a set and certain outfits, and there's an audience that probably got a program and told you who was playing what part. Very modern, very typical modern. Just picture the normal theater experience, and it's very modern in its form. In contrast, there's many postmodern performance artists happening now. Flash mobs, this group Improv Everywhere, lots of things you're seeing, videos you're seeing on the internet of things happening that no one's quite sure what's happening, all of a sudden it happens. And that's this skit, is this show or event, if you will. They call it a mission. This group from Manhattan, Improv Everywhere, calls them missions. So every January 1st, I believe it is, in New York City, these people that are part of Improv Everywhere, hundreds of them, get on trains with no pants, one at a time at different stops on these subway lines that all head toward Grand Central Station. So one after the next, they come on with no pants. And I'm sure if you were on the train, one person gets on, you live in New York City, and you see this guy's got no pants on, and you're probably thinking, here we go, right? New York City. There's a nut. Everywhere you go, there's someone who's crazy. But then more and more people come on with no pants over the next several stops, and they don't talk to each other. They act normal. And then all of the trains come together at Grand Central Station, and all these people all at once with no pants on get off. And that's the no pants mission that Improv Everywhere does once a year. They do dozens of skits year-round in New York, somewhere in New York City. You've probably seen them on the internet. If you haven't, look them up. They're hilarious. But there's no program. There's no official stage or staging or set. There's no set beginning or ending time. People don't buy tickets. They don't have assigned seats. This is just very postmodern, where the audience members become part of the performance because their reaction and their participation in it becomes part of it. The postmodern condition is also marked by the rise of new artistic practices, some of which we've mentioned already. They're very fond of using a medley or a jumbled mishmash of different elements. So they just push things together that you might not expect. It's not meant to be unified or coherent. You might look at a painting or a design so you see this guy he's made out of a deodorant or body spray can, and you might think, okay, so you made this guy, what's the point? And they would say, there is no point. We just made something because that's what we had. And he's even got a little tie on, so he's formal. It's postmodernists like to construct things from what is available. They might use old and familiar things, but in unexpected ways. So they look at their environment around them, and they use those materials, they use those perspectives. The growth of graffiti is a very postmodern kind of art, where you have people right where they are using affordable materials to paint in their local community and mark it up. So that's very postmodern. They're not asking permission, and it can be very playful, this postmodern artistic expression, or very serious. Here's some different illustrations. All You Need Is Work, which is a play on All You Need Is Love, which is the name of a Beatles song. This is supposed to be an album cover. It's supposed to look like an album cover by the Beatles, the Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band album. And a very postmodern album. It's a concept album. Very strange. So here we have Coca-Cola's logo, which has been co-opted. They're using something familiar in a new way. That word pastiche is a very postmodern word. And it's being pastiche, is taking something and co-opting it, using it. There's a lot of toilet humor out there, very postmodern, different, especially in metropolitan areas. People paint and get creative with their toilets. And so I don't know if you walked into a local business and saw this toilet, how welcoming that would feel to you, but there's a whole genre of toilet art like this. And in the bottom right you have some what look like tennis shoes, running shoes, sneakers, and it's made out of very non-traditional materials. This is all computer circuitry and computer boards. If you look closely, you can see the wires, or the laces are wires, and the bottom is made of computer board, circuit board. So this is very postmodern in its approach. It's not like normal sculpture where you take a bunch of clay or chisel some stone and make a sculpture. They're making things out of whatever they have and whatever way they can.